morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Christy Schmidt, Assistant Director of Knowledge Exchange and Communications here at Farm Credit East. Before we get started, just a few technology tips to keep in mind while you're viewing today's webinar. All attendees will be muted throughout the presentation, and every once in a while just be sure to tap your mouse so that your screen doesn't go to sleep during the presentation. There will be time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation, but you can text chat in those questions throughout today's presentation, and then they'll all be held and asked of Dr. Barnaby at the end. And finally, a recording of today's presentation will be available on farmcrediteast.com/webinars for playback at a later time. If you have any trouble accessing this recording, you can contact myself, Christy Schmidt, at 800-562-2235. And now I'll pass it over to Bob Smith to get started.
Okay, good morning, everyone. And on behalf of the Farm Credit East Knowledge Exchange Program, I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar today. We are thrilled that we have participants throughout the Northeast on our webinar today. It's kind of amazing to think that with the weather being below zero, it seems like for at least half the days over the last month, with 3 to 6 feet of snow out there, that in about 3 months, field work's going to be pretty active in the Northeast, at least in some locations, and people are going to be out in the fields making or getting started with their crops. But before that time, we've got an important decision that needs to be made by folks as it relates to the 2014 Farm Bill. And with us today to talk about that decision on cash field crops is Dr. Art Barnaby. He is a professor of agricultural economics at Kansas State University. He was raised on a diversified farm in Elk County, Kansas. He received his BS degree from Fort Hays State University, his MS from New Mexico State University, and PhD in agricultural economics from Texas A&M University. Art joined the agricultural economics faculty at Kansas State in 1979 and is a professor there. Art conducts national extension education programs on market risk, government commodity programs, crop insurance, and public policy. He was named by Top Producers Editors List as one of 30 brave thinkers, 30 leaders who made a difference, and on their list of 7 economists, bankers who changed the status quo. He's authored several research projects on crop insurance issues and their impacts on farmers. Art is a past winner of the Excellence in Extension Award presented at the National Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities. He is also a 3-time winner of the American Agricultural Economics Association Distinguished Extension Program Award. He's a frequent speaker at professional and farmer producer meetings throughout the country. We are very pleased to welcome back to the Farm Credit webinar series Dr. Barnaby to talk about the Agricultural Act of 2014, the Farm Bill, and decision-making as it relates to the Agricultural Risk Coverage Program and the Price Loss Coverage Program. So with that, Art, welcome back, and we'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for having me. Does my slide show up on the screen, and is it a full spread?
Yes,
okay.
It does, and you're all set.
All right, thank you. Okay, first of all is our disclaimer. There are various things in this commodity program that have changed even though we're well into sign up. The most recent one was an update on the county yields used for Art County, and we can't guarantee that there won't be changes in the future. So with that disclaimer, let's start off with the very first decision that has to be made before the end of the month. And that is to update your program yields. The program yields are based on the yields 2008 through 12. You definitely want to do this if you can show a higher program yield. Even if you're not going into the price loss coverage or PLC program, you still want to update your program yields if you can prove a higher yield, simply because that remains with the land. It would go with the sale of the land, the higher program yield would make the land more valuable. On top of that, future renters would also benefit from that. And there just hasn't been that many times when you've been able to update program yields. The last time was in 2002, but in that particular version, you had to update the reallocate the acres before you were allowed to update the program yield. This time around, these are independent decisions. You can update the program yield and not reallocate your acres, and vice versa. You could reallocate the acres and not update the program yield, or you can do both. It's strictly up to the grower. Actually, to be technically correct, the landowner has to sign off on this decision. The key items here is this is the yields that were produced during 2008 through 12. Yields in 13 and thereafter do not influence this number. Once this yield is set, it will remain in effect for the life of the Farm Bill, and it's either the yield that was sent to you in a letter probably last summer from FSA. It said on it the countercyclical yield, and this is your opportunity to update that number from what was provided last summer. Now, if you can't prove a higher yield, you just keep the current one, so there's really no downside to doing this. On the reallocation of base acres, as a general statement, most farmers would prefer corn base to soybean base, so if based on your plannings, and again they change the years here, it's 9 through 12, it's a different set of years, but based on those 4 years, if you can show more corn acres, you probably want them. Wheat acres would be somewhere in between, but as far as program crops, probably most folks in your part of the world are corn and soybeans. There are 3 programs. The first one is a price loss coverage program. This is essentially the same as the deficiency program that was in place prior to 1996, with just some name changes. What we used to call target price is now called reference price, and the reference price for corn is $3.70. If the national average price falls below $3.70, you are paid the difference between that and the national average price. For example, if the national average price, which won't be available until about the 1st of October of 2015, were to come in at $3.60, you would get the difference between $3.70 and $3.60, which is 10 cents times that updated program yield that we just talked about. The price loss, or the national average price, will change each year depending on what the market does. The yield portion of PLCO is locked in at the end of February. The other alternative is the agricultural risk coverage at the county level. This is simply the Olympic average price times the Olympic average yield, but they use a different set of years. They are using 13 through it would be 9 through 13 to set the yield, the risk guarantee for the first year, 9 through 13. Next year that will roll over and we'll use the years 10 through 14. So it's a moving Olympic average price and Olympic average yield. In this case, the only number that actually ties back to your farm individually is the number of base acres you have. The price is external to the farm. It's determined by NASS. It's not futures. It's not crop insurance, etc. It is a national survey price, and there's only one price for the entire country. For example, on wheat, there's many different classes of wheat. There's durum, spring, white wheat, hard red winter wheat, soft red winter wheat, and all of them have a little slightly different market, but the reality is in the commodity program, just one national average price. Finally is the ARC individual coverage. In this case, it's a guarantee is based off the 5-year Olympic average revenue, and by Olympic average I mean you throw out the high number, the low number, and average the remaining 3. The ARC individual uses the national price for price portion of calculating the revenue, and then the individual farmer's historical yield. Again, this is yields for 9 through 13, as opposed to what we talked earlier about, which is 8 through 12. Quite confusing that they didn't use the same years for all of these things, but they didn't. The supplemental coverage is an insurance contract. I show it attached to PLC. The reality is you can have SCO as long as the crop on that farm serial number is not enrolled in ARC, either through the county version or the individual version. So it could show up if you're planting, say, corn on wheat base, you had the wheat enrolled in ARC. That's okay as long as the corn is not enrolled in ARC, and you would get the wheat payment, but you could also add supplemental coverage on the corn. The kicker on the individual coverage is they only pay on 65% of the base acres. Does my cursor show up on the screen as a pointer?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And then with the ARC County, the kicker there is you get paid on 85% of the base acres. So clearly Congress was trying to discourage people from going into the individual coverage. It's far more complicated. Guarantee changes every year depending on what's planted, and you're going to spend a lot of time at the FSA office going through records if you choose the individual. However, we have, through our software, discovered there are farms that would benefit from the individual coverage, and then those folks have to decide, is the additional paperwork that's going to be required and time involved in getting that paperwork done worth the difference in the payment. But for a lot of folks, ARC County or PLC probably will be the choice. In the case of PLC, you're paid on 85% of the base acres, the same as you are on the SCO, and if you're not enrolled into ARC County, you can add the supplemental coverage. On the supplemental coverage, first of all, it's the last dollar of coverage, and you'll discover in many cases the premium rate is fairly expensive. If you want to calculate premium rate across coverages and across price levels and all the other variables that change, all you need to do is take the premium you're paying and divide it by the total dollars of coverage from the policy, regardless if it's hail or federal crop or any other for that matter. And you divide those two numbers and it'll come back, give you a percentage, which in effect, if you multiply by 100, is the dollars of premium paid per $100 of coverage. In the case of many locations, farmers have discovered it's just as cheap and maybe preferable just to up their existing coverage rather than add the SCO. Remember, the SCO is triggered off the county yield, not your individual farm yield. Once it's triggered, though, it comes back to your APH. With the individual coverage, of course, it just matters what happens on your farm as far as triggering payments under the insurance program. ARC and PLC, they have no premium. Of course, with the SCO, it's a crop insurance contract. You get that from your insurance agent. ARC and PLC, you sign up at the Farm Service Agency office. So two different agencies. Payment limits on ARC is $125, or on ARC and PLC is $125,000, and it is tied back to Social Security numbers. So it's getting more difficult to create new entities to avoid the payment limit. There are no payment limits for the supplemental coverage because it is crop insurance. At this point, there is no payment limit on crop insurance, and as a result, that could be important, is important for larger farms who are up against payment limit issues. The major limitation on ARC is the fact that you can't get more than 10% of the benchmark revenue. Think of that as the expected revenue, which is the Olympic average price times the Olympic average yield. SCO payments can be higher than ARC because, again, there's no payment limit. It's paid on all planted acres, not just base acres, etc. As I said, PLC is just a new version of the old deficiency program, and as you can see, the corn deficiency target price was $263. We changed the name to reference price and set it at $370. So, but it works exactly the same. If the price is below that reference revenue, you're paid the difference. Revenue protection is more of a shallow loss coverage, probably expected to trigger more often. You're paid if the actual revenue falls below 86% of the benchmark revenue. The benchmark revenue is the Olympic average yield times the national, the 5-year Olympic average national price times the 5-year Olympic average county yield. Very similar to the ARC acre program that was in the last Farm Bill, except we are using county yields rather than state yields that was used in that program. The ARC individual is 5-year Olympic average of the individual's revenues. It uses the national price, but the farmer's individual yields. And in both cases, payment maxes out at 10% of the benchmark revenue. SCOs and add-on crop insurance coverage provides coverage up to 86%, down to wherever you purchased your individual coverage. Just remember that last chunk of coverage under SCO is triggered strictly by county yield loss. If the county doesn't suffer a loss, there is no payment regardless of what happened on your farm. It's available for all planted acres, not just those enrolled in, as long as it's not enrolled in ARC. That is the key, and no payment limits. There are a lot of details in this thing, and we have a lot of supporting material that for those that want more information can come to our website, agmanager.info. That is the main site, but under there we have we go through the calculation of the payment itself step by step for each of the 3 programs. There are 3 separate videotapes out there that go through the calculations. Also, we videotaped our conference in Wichita, Kansas, which our actual presentation's approximately 3 hours long. And we broke that up into sections, sent it over to radio and TV here on campus to have it edited, so you can go back and look at a particular program and look at the videotape presentation of it, and you can also go through the calculations at your own speed. All of that's available on agmanager.info at no cost to you. This is an example of the PLC calculations. In the videotape, I walk through each one of these calculations and where they came from, and to come up with the payment that would be calculated under the assumption that we have low prices in that case. This is an example of a corn for a New York county. I would pronounce this county, but I'm not sure how you pronounce the name. But hopefully
Cayuga County, Art.
Pardon me?
Cayuga County.
Cayuga County, okay. You're never sure about some of these names when you're not a native. You could mispronounce it and everybody gets a good laugh. Any case, a couple things here about this one. And for this, I'm going to see if I can't bring up the arrow to actually make sure everybody sees what I'm talking about. First of all is the program yield. This is your individual farm program yield. It's based on the yields 8 through 12. It's the updating of the program yield that we talked about earlier that has to be done by the end of this month. This number does not change once it's set on March 1st. It will not change during the life of the Farm Bill. So that number will be locked in. It is unique to your farm. It's either the updated yield or your existing yield. The other important yield is the 5-year Olympic average yield, and this is based on the years 9 through 13. And next year that number will change because it will be based on the years 10 through 14. In any case, those numbers is a moving number. This one, of course, is not. The reference price is $370 in the case of PLC. For the ARC County, you can see it's substantially higher at $529. And if you multiply these two numbers together, your benchmark revenue is $749 for this particular county. The break-even point is $317. That means if your county, if your individual yield that you updated by the end of this month happens to be the same as the county Olympic average, This is the average farmer that doesn't exist anywhere. But if they are exactly equal, then at a price below 317, that's when the PLC payment would pay more than the ARC County payment. So that's the break-even point. It's not below 317, you trigger payments. But in order for the PLC payment to exceed the ARC County payment, it would have to fall to 317. Now, if your yield is greater than that, then it doesn't need to fall all the way to 317 before the PLC payment is larger. For example, if we look down here at 378, we're above the reference price of 370, at least, and the payment is 0 in that case under PLC. If the county yield is average and we are at 378, under the ARC County, the payment is $74.96, and that is at the maximum. So you're maxing out the payment at 378 if the county yield is average and no payment under PLC. Now, if the payment were, if the price, again, we won't know this until the 1st of October 2015, about 8-9 months from now. If it comes in at 361, the difference between that and the reference price of 370 is 9 cents. You multiply the 9 cents times your individual program payment yield, in this case 141.7, and we come up with a payment of $12.74. Again, if you're at the average, you have a payment of $74.96. Now, if the yield is exceptionally good, it starts to cut into that ARC County payment. For example, at 170 bushels, which I believe is 20% higher, you end up cutting that payment from $74.96. So higher yields cut into the payment under the ARC County, which is another factor you have to deal with. Now, looking at PLC at 314, at this point the payment is $79.35, and unless you have exceptionally high yields, the payment's going to max out on ARC County, but at a lower $74.96. If the bottom falls out of the market and you end up with $2.74, now you're getting $136 from PLC, and $74.96 is what the likely payment is from the ARC County. So to summarize here, well, let me take one other scenario. Suppose we have a 490 price. I don't think it's going to be that. It's not going to be that high in the first year, but who knows in the out years. At 490 and a below average county yield, we max out the ARC payment at $74.96. Remember, this is a revenue guarantee, the ARC County is, so low yields can also trigger payments. But also, high yields can eliminate payments. So if you got high yield, even with a price below $4, a high yield, and the payment is 0. I actually have been in eastern Kansas where farmers are telling me they've got the best corn yield they've ever had in their entire farming career. Assuming that is true, then I don't expect ARC County payments under that condition, and the reason is it's not that the price is not low enough. I think the yield is going to be high enough to actually eliminate the payment. So that's the other half of the coin. On this one, the hole in the PLC safety net is if you get a short crop and the price goes up, say to 490, the payment is 0 under PLC, but at the same time you have no bushels to sell at the higher price, assuming you're in the middle of whatever the problem is. Now, the truth is, there's only, when it comes to corn, there's really only 3-4 states that really matter, and you know who they are, starting with Iowa. Number 2 is Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota, and probably back to Iowa. If they have problems in that area of the country, they're likely to drive those prices higher. Even Ohio probably doesn't impact it that much. In fact, Kansas is almost as big a feed grain state as Ohio, and some years it's bigger depending on whether or not we get rain out here. But nonetheless, that is what how these trade-offs work. So thinking about this, if you think prices are going to fall below $3 down to the 280 catastrophic price loss, then over the next 5 years, then likely you would want to select the PLC payment. Also, if you're risk adverse and can't afford to take a price that low, in other words, if price really does fall to 280, you're bankrupt, call the auctioneer, you're done. Even if you think the other program is going to pay more, you'd probably take the PLC to protect you against catastrophic risk. The problem I have is not very many farmers I run into are risk adverse. They're more likely to take risk if they think they can make a little extra money at it. Probably the worst case I like to always, as an example, is Dodge City, Kansas cattle feeders. They are an interesting group. They can lose a couple $100 on a pen of cattle being fed, and their attitude is, we'll feed 3 pens next time, probably make it all back, and all we need is a good partner like Farm Credit. Just hang in there and keep rolling the note. Eventually it'll work out. Lenders get a little nervous with that kind of viewpoint, but trust me, I swear if they weren't feeding cattle, they would be at the Indian casinos. Now, most farmers aren't quite that risk-seeking, but they are willing to take prudent risks. So that kind of summarizes where it has to get. On the other hand, if you think we're going to keep prices in this $3.50 to $4 range, then more likely you would select the ARC payment. Not only does it protect you on price, but if you happen to have low yields in the county, that can also trigger payments even with much higher prices. So a bad yield in your area that doesn't impact the price, and if you're not in Iowa, it probably doesn't, then you end up getting payments due to low yields even though your prices are higher. So hopefully that kind of gives you the waterfront of these two programs. The ARC individual is very similar to how I've described ARC County, except that in that case you have individual yields being used rather than county yields. Okay, I got to get rid of this. Let's see, I need to go over here and okay. Alrighty, this is wheat. A very similar story. If the price of wheat ends up being $5.68, we look across there, you're going to need a below average yield to max out the payment at $4.26. In this case, you need about a 50 bushel yield. The $5.68 is right now between the price for wheat somewhere between $5.68 and $6 nationally. So at this point, I think it's virtually impossible there's going to be any PLC payment on wheat in the first year. In addition to that, the ARC County is also not going to pay with these price levels without a reduction in yield. And in some cases, we already know what those numbers are. This shows you the soybeans, a similar story here. But again, you have to have prices below $8.40 to trigger payments. I think there's odds of collecting from soybeans on PLC is less than it is from corn, simply because we got prices that are substantially higher than the $8.40 trigger. And even if it hits the $8.40 trigger, it's like the corn. It has to get down there towards $7. Call it $7.30 if your yield is above the county average. County average for this particular county is 45.3. And I pulled that from USDA's website. This is the ARC individual, comparing it to the county version. ARC individuals based off the 5-year Olympic average revenues as opposed to price times yield. I don't know why the difference, because in a lot of cases you get a similar number, Olympic averaging revenue versus Olympic averaging yield, and then Olympic averaging price and multiplying the two. ARC pays on 65% of the base acres versus 85%, so clearly they wanted farmers not to go this route. But again, we're finding cases where it does work, and it's primarily where you don't track with the county. Now, a lot of farmers track with the county more than they think they do, so don't read anything into that. The other thing is that all revenue on that farm serial number counted corn against the guarantee. So if you got both corn and soybeans on that farm serial number, revenue from both crops are going to count. If one of those crops fails but the other one makes, you well could eliminate the payment because all revenue counts against it. This program was put in here because of Senator Baucus of Montana. In the western states, the counties are as large as many states, or at least in the eastern portion of the country. So these large counties out in the western states argued that the yield varies so much across that county, and it really does, going from the east side of that county to the west side. It gets drier as you go west, substantial difference in the wheat yields. So it's put in for them. Bottom line, though, is the other thing is in many of these locations they only have two crops, and that's wheat and summer fallow, followed by summer fallow and wheat. So there are no multiple crops to count against the guarantee, so effectively it is a wheat guarantee only. The more diversified you are, the less this program will provide in the way of protection. So keep that in mind when you're looking at this. Even so, I plugged in here a 90 bushel county yield and an individual yield of 150. Work through the arithmetic here. Because this gets paid on 85% of the acres, the average payment across all base acres is $40.47, even with a low county yield versus a very high individual yield. If the individual yield of 150, because you multiply it times 65%, you see there's only about a $9 difference in those payments. And if that yield is a little bit lower, obviously these numbers narrow up. Individuals have to decide if, even with maybe a payment of only $2 or $3 higher, is it really worth $2 or $3 an acre for the extra time you're going to spend doing the paperwork and record keeping with FSA? And remember, through all of this, the bulk of your safety net is going to be in the crop insurance program. Okay, this slide here is also really important to look at. I'm going to show you wheat because we got more price information on wheat, but don't worry, I'm going to get to corn. Back in June, NASS surveys grain buyers nationwide, and by that I mean they survey people like ADM, Cargill, the large co-ops, Anderson Grain, Bunge, etc. And what they get is the total bushels that entity purchased and the total dollars they paid for those bushels. They then aggregate those numbers between all buyers, and they divide the two numbers. In other words, they divide the total bushels purchased during that month from all buyers and the total dollars from all buyers and come up with the price for that month. In June, that number was $6.50 for wheat. That is a final number. It is locked in. The 13 here is a estimate of the weight because it's a weighted national average price. What that means, and we won't know this number till July 1st at the end of the marketing year, and marketing year for wheat is June 1 through May 31st. So it has an earlier marketing year than does corn, which is September 1 through August 31st. So that's why we're further along on the wheat price than we are on the corn price. In any case, this weight has been fairly stable over the years, so I think it's a reasonable estimate, but obviously it'll be a little bit different once it's actually calculated. And in at the end of June, they'll publish this, call it 1st of July, it's easier to remember. USDA will go through and they will calculate the percent of crop, of the total crop that was sold in that month. We are estimating that 13% of the wheat crop will be sold in the month of June. That number, again, will not be determined until we get to the end, so all the weights are estimates. Everything over here that's in black, these numbers are all final numbers. But notice that the weights, unless farmers greatly change their marketing from one year to the next, and I don't expect this on wheat, corn, or soybeans, we're at 13%. You can see the first 3 months of the marketing year carry really big weights. Half of the wheat price is determined in the first 3 months of the marketing year. Now, we will look on here got a surprise in January. Up till this point, NAS was in their most current report reported the final number for December, which was 611 for wheat, and they published a preliminary number for January. Well, right when you need it, NAS stops publishing their preliminary number. So they no longer put out a preliminary number, so that is still a KSU estimate. Everything in red is a KSU estimate. By March 1st, which is probably the longest you can wait to make your final decision, you will have this number here will turn black as it will become final, and that will leave the last four numbers here as estimates. But even if you're wrong, they carry very small weights, so as a result, the final price should not be terribly different from where I'm at right now at $5.91. So I'm expecting it to be somewhere in the $5.90 to $6 range at the end. The other thing to glean from this is the Olympic average price used to set the ARC guarantee. That's the 5-year Olympic average price. Currently, in the current year, we eliminate the low price, which is $5.50. By the way, the actual price was lower, but if you have a lower price in the history, you always replace it with the reference price. So your historical price, it could never be less than $5.50. But anyway, at $5.50, you eliminate that, you eliminate the $7.71, and you average the remaining 3 years, and you come up with a price of $6.60, and that is used to set the current wheat guarantee. Now, next year, we will eliminate the 2009 year drops out of the history, and we will add a year 14-15 marketing year price, and let's just say that comes in at $5.91. If it comes in at $5.91, then you eliminate the high price. The $5.91 is greater than $5.70, so you would also eliminate the low price. Currently, that $5.70 is in the average. Because it drops out and is replaced with a higher number, the price next year for wheat's going up. It'll be $6.67 if the price is $5.91. If that price ends up being a little higher, we'll end up with a higher number. As long as that price that we end up with is greater than $5.70, and I think the odds are it will be, we will have a higher price next year on wheat. That does not mean a higher guarantee, however, because the county yield is also a moving Olympic average, and if that county Olympic average were to decline from the current year, then next year's guarantee could actually go down even with a higher price. On the corn, oh, I got to get rid of this, excuse me. On the corn, we have a similar story to tell, except unfortunately we don't have as many numbers. The 348, for example, is final, so everything in black is final. We could have really used that number, the preliminary number. Again, NAS stopped producing a preliminary number, so that's strictly an estimate from K-State. And I base those estimates off of expected basis and deferred futures prices if you want to know how I'm coming up with them. Notice that the weights for corn are different too, because the marketing year for it is different. The big weights are in October and November. You skip December because of income tax, and January is a big number. So this number we really would like to know. You will know that on March 1st, which will leave you 30 days left to make a decision, but it'll have a big impact on your price. You'll actually know this number here about 24 hours before FSA closes out. However, I don't know, even if you change your mind, I don't know if you can get FSA to actually change the result if for some reason you get a big surprise in February that changes your mind. But nonetheless, we will have most of the corn price, because again the big weights are here, can determine by March 1st, and at that point that's about all the information you're going to have as far as making a decision on whether to go ARC County or ARC Individual. Again, remember these are first year prices. Right now we're at 377, and at that level, if that holds, there would be no PLC payment. Next year, this year 370 gets eliminated and the high price is 389, average the remaining 3 years. If next year we drop out 09 and we add in the price for 14-15, which if it turns out to be 377, that won't raise next year's guarantee because the 377 will be the low. In the case of corn, you would need a price above 446, and I don't see any chance of that happening. The 377 is the estimate right now, and I don't see any chance that the 14 price will be higher than 446. As a result, that means next year's price is going to be exactly the same as it is this year. So those numbers, you can basically lock them in. So next year's guarantee will have the same price. That doesn't mean your guarantee is going to go up because it'll depend on whether your Olympic average yield increased or decreased. Looking at the next, let's look at soybeans real quick. Oh, I didn't want to do that. Soybeans real quick. And in the case of soybeans, we're estimating at 974. Has to drop below 840 to trigger any PLC payments. Next year, the price is going to remain the same for the same reasons I explained on corn. Similar marketing pattern too. October has a really big weight, as you can see. At least historically it has. In this case, the price was low. If that historical number hangs in there, that estimated price, that actually lowers this number over what you thought it would be. Of course, that makes the payment bigger on Ark County if the price is low. Right now, it doesn't look like it's going to be low enough to do anything for PLC, but remember, the January carries a big weight, and you'll have that by March 1st. If you look at the historical numbers, everything prior to 13 is all history. 14, and that the first number in the marketing year 2014, that's the year you harvested the crop. 15 is when the marketing year ended. So that's how you read those numbers. But looking across there, you can see using the KSU estimate, and then 15 through 18, those years, those prices are all from the University of Missouri. They are factory prices. The reason I'm using factory prices is I don't have any better estimate than Missouri does, and since it's a long-range forecast, I don't have to defend the number. It's Missouri's number. The 377, we're continuously tracking that on our website. By the way, if you'd like to get a note every time that estimate is updated, all you have to do is send us an email address, and we'll be glad to add you. There's, again, no cost to you, but don't send us an email and get on our email list for our web updates unless you want to hear from us. You're already getting too many emails. You don't want to add us. In any case, if you look across those numbers there for corn, notice they're all above 370. If that forecast turns out to be true, and I already know the forecast is wrong, I just don't know the direction. But if that were the final, if that's the way the final numbers end up looking over the 5 years of this program, notice that the PLC payments on corn would be 0. Same is true for soybeans. How good do you think Missouri can forecast prices? I don't know, but that's what you're betting on. Notice also I've got this year's Olympic average price, and I've got next year's Olympic average price based on FAPRI estimates. And in this case, notice that the corn price doesn't start to decline until year 16. The year that would really drop off if FAPRI's estimates are correct is in the year 18, making it more difficult to collect anything from the Ark County, because that's going to lower the guarantee probably unless you have some exceptionally high yields. Wheat, on the other hand, actually is going to have the price increase next year, and based on the FAPRI prices remain there, and so it doesn't start to decline until the year 17 with a big drop off in the back year. And similar numbers there for soybeans to look at. The other half of that equation is what happens with the county yield. What I'm showing you here is York County, Nebraska. York County, Nebraska is all under center pivots, all level ground, some of the most productive corn ground in the world. Every bit of that county is under center pivot. They got water forever. It's not like they're running out of water. I know y'all read that, but not there. Now that's true in Texas, but not in this particular location in Nebraska. Notice that the yield variability is very low in that county. Almost no yield variability. Again, that's because very stable yields. Now they do get losses. You could have a quarter section of irrigated corn get hailed out, but that quarter section isn't going to have any impact on the aggregate county number, or very little. You will hardly be able to measure it. The point is, if you have really low variability, let's take the extreme. Let's suppose you could find a county somewhere that had no yield variability, that they had the same yield year after year. In that case, what you end up with is effectively a put option, because if there's no yield variability, it's strictly a put. And very much like PLC, except that your strike price is $529 times 86%, which I believe works out to about $454, something like that. Would you rather, and in that case, you would get payments if price drops below $454, because it does not impact anything from the yield side of the equation if you have no yield variability. So the lower the yield variability, the more Ark County looks like a PLC program or a put program with a very high strike price, at least in current market, because a $454 put is actually in the money today. Now you do have that 10% stop loss. Don't lose track of that. The other extreme is Ellis County. This is a central Kansas county, and you notice all these yields are 48 bushels. What that means is their yields were way down there, and if you got a really low county yield, they replace it with 70% of the T yield. So what that number is 70% of the T yield. And when you do Olympic average, you're going to end up with 48 bushels because you throw out the high and low. But notice back here in 09, they got a rain that year, and they got 107 bushels. The point is that if you get 107 bushels, that's 100+% higher than the Olympic average. And if you get a yield that's 100% higher than the Olympic average, the price is not going to get low enough to actually create a payment under Ark County. So with that kind of yield, there is no Ark County payment, and can't be even with very low prices. On the other hand, if you have a yield below 48 bushels, the point is you're going to max out the payment because you're going to hit the 10% stop loss. The point I'm trying to make to you is effectively the yield to the downside is cut, because it doesn't do you any good to have a 50% yield loss. Only takes about 5 or 10%, and you hit the maximum payment. So anything lower does no good other than lower your guarantee for the next year. On the other hand, if you got that kind of yield variability, plus or minus 50%, and the county has a yield that's 50% higher than average, that describes eastern Kansas corn, then that higher yield eliminates the payment. So the upside variability takes out the payment. Now, if you don't have any yield variability, you don't get 50% above average, because the thing is always running average, like York County, Nebraska, because there aren't many variables that's going to influence that yield. Cayuga County looks to have a very stable yield too, and not a lot of variation if you look at the number, although looks like it was down in 13, and you're going to lose that 14-year, excuse me, lose that 10-year out of your distribution fairly quick. Losing that 152, which is now being dropped out of the Olympic average, that means you're going to eliminate maybe the 143, which is currently in the average, out. So you'd rather have the high yield occur in 13. Looking at your county, you got the absolute opposite. You got the low yield in 13. What that means is that low yield of 137 is going to be in the history of this particular Ark County program for the entire life of the Farm Bill, by occurring in 13, and you'll lose the 2010 yield in the third year of this Farm Bill. So lots of moving parts, obviously. wanted to show you briefly how payments are looking because we have more information on wheat. They have in Kansas released the Nass County yields for the 14-15 marketing year. This is not the final number that FSA will pay on, but they will start with the Nass yield and probably adjust it. Starting off with here in Atchison County, the Olympic 5-year Olympic average yield is 43 bushels. This year's yield was 53, well above average. As a result, you'll notice the payment, in fact, is 0. However, the farmer does get some benefit from this because that 53 bushels will now be in the average next year, and the 43 is going to drop out. The 09 year will drop out. And along with the higher wheat price, the guarantee would increase from $283 to an expected $312 level. So his guarantee will be higher next year, but no payment this year. And of course, that doesn't necessarily guarantee you're going to get a payment next year. It just means you have a higher guarantee to start with. On the other hand, Barber County had a really low yield, 13 bushels, the lowest in this recent 5-year history, well below the Olympic average yield of 33.7. As a result, you calculate the payment and it comes out to $114. The problem is you don't get paid $114. You can't get more than 10% of the reference revenue, which in this case is $22.22. That is the payment for that county. Even if I'm off on the price forecast, and even if FSA adjusts that county yield down a little bit because they might bring in some failed acre numbers, bottom line, that is your payment, period, for the life of the farm bill. Now, Cowley County is in between. They had a 34 bushel yield. When you look at their history, they've had worse yields. In fact, they had a worse one in 09. A perfect place to have it, by the way, because next year that'll drop out of the history. So they've had, but they've also had yields much higher. Here's 50 and 51, so it's somewhere in between. Their guarantee is $253. At a price forecast of $591, their current payment is $16.64. Now, if that price is higher than $591, then this payment will actually shrink to something less than $16.64. The maximum payment in this county is $25.30. I don't see price getting low enough to actually trigger the maximum, but likely there will be some payment in this county. And the guarantee is going to go from $253 to $267 as a result of the Olympic average yield, particularly dropping out that 26 bushel yield, and also the higher price. I showed these 3 counties because they show you how the payments can be all over the board. Atchison County, I can tell you right now, is not getting any wheat payment under PLC or Art County in the first year. Okay, wow. At this point, you have to you're going to have to make a decision. As a rule of thumb, the corn may, and I emphasize may, have a PLC payment in the first year. Possible that you could have a catastrophic event in the future. So if you thought corn prices are going to drop below $3, or you don't want to take the risk of corn prices below $3, then PLC is probably your choice. If, on the other hand, you like the idea of getting payments more often and maybe even be able to look at the numbers and come up with a pretty good estimate if there's going to be payments in the first year, do you take that payment and then worry about the back 4 years later, or do you leave the cash on the table in the hope, or maybe not hope, but in the concern that the future payment might be substantially larger due to prices below $3? Soybeans has less chance of collecting from PLC than does the corn. Not saying the soybean couldn't end up with a PLC payment, but I think it's more likely to see a PLC payment on corn before you see one on wheat. One possibility is that farmers might elect, particularly if they're over the payment limit, to put their corn in PLC and put their soybeans in Art County, betting, sort of hedging your bets, assuming that you're more likely to see PLC payments on corn than you are on soybeans. On the other hand, if it looks like you're going to get an Art County payment, on the corn, and we'll know more about that by March 1st. It is difficult to leave money on the table just to cover a potential event that might not ever occur. Finally, I would remind everyone that you have revenue coverage, crop insurance in most cases under this, with no payment limits and no stop losses. So even if the price did go to $3, you're likely to see a very large crop insurance payment in addition to this. So the other thing is, the bottom line is, we're only talking about maybe 5 to 10% of your gross income. So even if you, quote, pick the wrong program as determined that you didn't pick the program that paid the highest amount over the 5 years, it probably is not a real killer since it's not a major chunk of your revenue for the most part. And you also have to remember, we haven't talked about the insurance coverage that's under much of this. Kansas State has a decision tool. There are many of these out there, but this one does cover the entire country. It is Excel based, so if you like Excel type programs, that is how this one is designed. You pick your state, you pick your county, and you pick your crops, all drop down menu kind of thing. It does require a version of Excel of 2007 or newer, so if you have an older version, it won't support these drop down menus. That's why it will not run. If alternatives, they are online. This one's all on your machine, so you're not tied into the internet, etc. You're not sending your data off to someone else. It's all on your machine. In the case of the online tools, which are at the University of Illinois and also at Texas A&M, in those cases you have to log in online, and it really makes a difference if you got a high-speed internet. If you've got a very slow internet or dial-up, you're not going to probably be very happy. So either the A&M one or the Illinois one. I think most Corn Belt states probably are using Illinois. In the case of the A&M model, it has cotton, so which you would not be dealing with. So if you have cotton, you're pretty much locked into the A&M model. This is a point estimate. You plug in your own numbers. You just type them in. If you don't like the way the numbers that we filled in, for example, in this screen here, I'm showing $3.40 for the corn price in 2014. If you believe my estimate of $3.77, you would just type over that number, and it will use $3.77. One of the questions we keep getting asked is, why did our results differ from those of Texas A&M? And this is also true for Illinois. Texas A&M and Illinois do random draws around the price and yield. So if you plug in $3.40, it assumes you don't know the price. They're assuming that's a guess, and therefore they will draw numbers around that, and they will, in that random draw, they will draw numbers below $3.70 and show PLC payments. If you plug $3.70 or higher into our decision aid, it will generate no PLC payments. It is strictly a point estimate or a budgeting kind of tool. It calculates all numbers based on what you actually enter. For example, we already know the wheat yield, so if I enter in the exact wheat yield number, the A&M model will draw wheat yields even though I know what the number is, and generate payments accordingly when we can already know what they are, and this model will do that. The results are presented in graphic as well as table format, and these are the people involved. In our case, Robin Reed is probably the person to call if you have any questions about this. There's no cost to this program. You simply come onto our site and you can download the Excel sheet. This is a list of other locations of decision tools that are on agmanager.info. These are remaining schedule out here for the state of Kansas, but anyway, at this point, floor is open to questions. Anything you didn't quite, that I went over too quick, remember, got videotape on our website that goes through the math to calculate a payment for PLC, the math for calculating an ARC individual, which is by far the most complicated program, as well as the math for determining a ARC county payment. And then we actually have the seminars itself only broken up into sections, so if you only want to watch the section on Ark County, you can watch that presentation on our website. And we will continue to update things to our website, including tracking that 5-month national average price that ultimately will determine whether or not there's payments.
That's a great presentation, a lot of insightful information, informative information there. Art, we greatly appreciate it. We do have a couple questions, and I would encourage folks on the webinar to please text chat your questions into us. First one, Art, could you explain the 10% stop loss provision? How does that work?
When you calculate the Olympic average revenue, which is simply the Olympic average price, national price, times the Olympic average county yield, you remember that 1 week example, it came up with like a $222 guarantee per acre, or revenue, reference revenue at that point, 222. You can't get more than 10% of that. That's why the number came out to $22.22. The actual calculated payment was well over $100, but you're only going to get $22.22 in that case. If I don't know if I can back up here easily or not, but if I can, we can go back and look at the New York County that was in there. It is not letting me back up. Oh, maybe it will. Okay. Yeah. Come on. Okay, here's Cuyahoga County, for example. The Olympic average yield. I didn't put the. I just put the yields in there, didn't I? I'm sorry, I can't really show it there. Here is the example of Atchison County, Kansas, for example. Again, this is wheat, but the Olympic average revenue is $283. That's that 5-year Olympic average price times the 5-year Olympic average yield. The maximum payment in that case is $28.38. So even if the payment comes out substantially higher, which it did for Barber County, and that's why the 13 bushels doesn't do any good. They would have got the $22 payment, you know, if this number had been 25. So the low yield beyond a certain point does absolutely no good. On the other hand, the high yield can take you out of the payment. And that's what I was showing here with Ellis. You know, if they get a rain out there, they can raise 100 bushels. They haven't done it lately, but they could end up with 100 bushels. And if that were the case, that would be a substantially higher price than, a substantially higher yield than the average, over 100%, and that would eliminate the payment. So the 10% stop loss is there. If under the acre program, that was a 25% stop loss. If this was a 25% stop loss on Ark County, game over. That would be your decision. The only reason that it's interesting is that you have that 10% stop loss, so once you hit that payment, and if prices do go down to $3, that's why you're going to get a bigger payment under PLC. If it had a 25% stop loss, see that Ark County payment would just get bigger, and it would match the PLC in that really severe low price scenario. Does that make sense?
I think so. I think that was a great explanation. The next question that came in, earlier you mentioned most farms would prefer corn rather than soybeans for base updates. Would you expand on that statement?
Well, first of all, the corn numbers are much closer to triggering payments. Corn yields have been trending up over time, and under the Ark County, remember this is a 5-year moving average, and if those corn yields continue to trend up, that will help maintain the guarantee or perhaps even increase it depending on what happens over on the national price side. So for that reason, I think most people would prefer corn. In the case of soybeans, we're at $8.40. That price under PLC for soybeans at $8.40 is probably low enough that a lot of farmers probably think we're unlikely to ever get there. Again, you can come up with a scenario that would put us there, but as long as we stay above 840, there is no soybean payment under PLC. Now, you could get payments under the Ark County, but for that reason, I think most people would prefer taking the corn base. Corn yields, again, have been trending up. Soybean yields, not so much. So another reason that you probably prefer corn to soybeans as far as base goes. Now, you can't just reallocate to corn. You had to actually plant that many acres of corn during that period, 9 through 12. So it's not something you can adjust in the future. It's just locked in. The individual coverage, that guarantee changes based on what's planted, and that's far more complicated, and I would suggest going through with our videotape to explain the calculations if you're actually thinking about going that route. But in the case of the individual, if you plant, say, 67 acres of corn on 100 acres of base this year and 33 acres of soybeans, then your guarantee is going to be based on 67% of your guarantee is going to be based on corn, 33% is going to be based on soybeans. Next year, if you reverse that planting and plant 67 acres of soybeans and 33 acres of corn, then your guarantee is going to be based on 67% of the soybean revenue and only 33% on the corn. So that's the one program where you can kind of move the guarantee around regardless of what your base is. But in the case of the Ark County and the PLC, in almost everyone I've talked to prefers corn to soybeans, and the wheat base is somewhere in the middle, but in your part of the world probably don't care much about the wheat base. You also got people that are reallocating base acres because they want to get rid of small wheat base that they may have, or they want to get rid of a barley base or an oat base that they had years and years ago, haven't planted those crops in recent time period. Because they have the flexibility this time, you can reallocate the acres and not update the payment yield. In the past, if you could reallocate the acres, but if you updated the payment yield and for some reason it was actually lower than what you already had, well, you really didn't want to do that. This time, you have complete flexibility on that decision.
Okay. Next question, and then again, I would encourage folks to please text chat your questions in. We have, I think, 2 more questions, unless we get a couple more. What happens? The question is, what happens if a producer does not take any action by the March 31 date? Are they allowed to then enroll in future years, or are they out of the program entirely?
If they don't enroll by March 31st, you're automatically placed in the PLC program, and you are not eligible for any payment in the first year. So you'd only get coverage for the last 4 years, and it would be PLC. I can't think of any reason why you wouldn't want to elect a program by the end of March. If you are cash renting, then the farmer himself makes that decision of which program to select. So certainly think you'd want to make a decision. If it is crop share rent, then both the farmer and the tenant have to agree. And I suppose you could get in a situation where the farmer and the tenant don't agree for one reason or another, and then you don't sign up. But that's what would happen.
Very good. The last question, I guess, to come in, Art, with crop insurance, crop insurance, won't most producers sign up for the ARC? I guess that's the question. What are you hearing out there?
The ones who actually run numbers, I think a lot of them will end up in Ark County. But I also think the PLC is, at the end of the day, is probably going to have the greatest participation, and here's why. Psychological research that they've run, if you give individuals multiple choices, which is what we've got here, most will pick the simpler solution. Even if they don't think it's better, they still pick the simple answer. And the simplest program is PLC. I don't think there's any question about that. And they're already familiar with it because it works just like deficiency payments. Why would they pick it? One, it's simple. Number two, regardless of the outcome, they can tell their landlords what it is, and they more or less don't have to defend their decision. As you saw with the Ark County, for example, low prices could trigger payments, low yields can trigger payments, but the reverse is also true. High yields can eliminate payments. And so you got high yield at the county, but you got a very low national average price, and the PLC's paying, the county's not. Now you got to explain to the landlord why we didn't get a payment. So you get into those kind of things. So, but I would tend to agree with that statement, is if they've actually run numbers through one of the calculators, in many cases they do end up with Ark County.
Okay. There's a question just came in. Is there a scenario where choosing SCO and forfeiting ARC is favorable to increasing the coverage level on the underlying MPCI policy and choosing ARC? You want me to do that one again, or is there?
Yeah, I know what they're asking. In effect, is the SCO coverage more valuable to you than the payment you're giving up on the Ark County? And this assumes there is an Ark County payment. Two things. Number one, you could take that Ark County payment and simply buy up on your existing coverage. Now, not everybody in the country has the same level of coverage, and I'm not sure if New York is one of the states that has 85% and 80% coverages offered to you. Some locations, like in Texas, on some crops, they don't have coverage greater than 75. But assuming you do, if you're at 85% coverage, then the SCO is only going to give you 1 point of additional coverage, and what I'm talking about is a very small dollar amount of coverage. So even if there's claim, it's not going to be big bucks. At the same time, you gave up payment under Ark County. At 80% coverage, there's only 6 points of additional coverage coming from the SCO, and it has to trigger at the county level. So with all those variables, I really don't think the ability to buy SCO or not buy SCO will be the determining factor. The other thing is, let's suppose I got 100 acres of wheat base, and I plant corn on that wheat base. I enroll the wheat in the Ark County. I can't buy SCO on the wheat, but I didn't plant wheat, so I can't buy SCO anyway because I don't have any planted acres. However, I did plant corn on there, and if there is a wheat payment, I'd get the wheat payment. Under that scenario, I could buy the SCO on the corn, even though those base acres are actually enrolled in the Ark County program. The key number here is the crop that's got the SCO coverage cannot be enrolled in Ark. It could be in nothing, which would be the case if the acres don't have any base on them, but it just can't be enrolled in Ark. Now, in the case of the individual coverage, there's no way around that one, because if you enroll in the individual coverage, it puts all the program crops into an Ark type program, and you would not be able to buy SCO in that case, even though you're planting that crop on a base other than, in this example, a corn base, such as a wheat base. So there are a lot of variables around that, so you may want to visit with a crop insurance agent to see if you are available, if the coverage is available to you. Again, one alternative is simply just to buy up on existing coverage. Think of it as you're getting payment from the government to pay an additional share of the premium if you're thinking along those lines. Anyway, it is, you could easily end up with a payment being bigger coming from Ark County than what you would get out of the SCO, even if it does trigger. So that's an alternative. The crop insurance decision, by the way, is an annual one. You could buy up on the coverage 1 year and lower it another year depending on what's happening with the premiums, which change year to year.
We do go to 85%, Art.
You do? Yeah, most people are at 85, but there's a lot of people out there at 80. And at 80%, SCO is not going to put a lot of additional coverage on top.
This was great. That's the last of the questions to come in. This has been a very informative session. Some good questions, but an excellent presentation. Art, any last wrap-up comments that you want to make? This webinar will be available as of tomorrow on farmcrediteast.com, and we will show that in just a minute. Art, any last wrap-up questions or comments, I should say?
My only comment is that videotape, papers, etc., covering the Farm Bill that would apply to New York just like it does us, or the East Coast, I guess I should say, available on agmanager.info. And so if folks want more detail than what we were able to go into today, they can really get down to the weeds by just coming to our website. Again, that's agmanager.info, and all of the material there is available at no cost to the user.
That's great, and that's a tremendous resource that you've provided. We really appreciate that. Again, all the presentations will be available on farmcrediteast.com/webinars. If anybody has any suggestions for future webinars, please feel free to contact us at Farm Credit East. Chris Lawton, our Director of Knowledge Exchange, is always looking for ideas. So a big thank you to Dr. Barnaby. We wish we could send you some of the snow that we're getting here right now in the Northeast out there, because we certainly have enough. But we greatly appreciate your willingness to do this another time, and I want to thank everybody for being on the webinar today, and have a great rest of the day. So thank you. Goodbye.